Greetings, brethren, and welcome. This is a presentation from the Rock Fortress Ministries. You can reach us on the email you see there, therockfortress@gmail.com, and the website www.therockfortress.net. Now, one of the things that we do here is to share alternative viewpoints on some of the prominent Christian doctrines. We try to call our brethren to reflect on how we as Christians and specifically as Adventists are putting together, our doctrines. Just to say that what we see is that generation after generation, as Christians in general and Adventists in particular, we have spent so much effort and put so much attention to patching up our doctrines, closing those loopholes and even tiptoeing around some of the difficult questions that challenge or even expose the inconsistencies of our doctrines. In the process, we have lost the capacity for critical self-reflection. Just the ability to stop and say, what are we saying here? Does this really make sense? Is this how it's supposed to be? Can we objectively, um, you know, without any emotion, review what we're talking about and think again that whether we're doing the right thing or not? The result of this lack of critical self-reflection is that we now find it very hard to see anything else other than from the myriad of patchworks that we've done to different doctrines. And I'm not saying every doctrine that we have is built from these patchworks, but I'm saying that there are a lot of doctrines which need to be looked at more carefully to actually consider whether we are no longer following tradition. I mean, we're no longer, following the Bible, actually following tradition. We need to know that we are still following the Bible, because these patchworks that have happened over the many centuries that have gone by have become a matter of tradition, and we are almost obliged to follow that tradition and to make some arguments which don't quite add up in the defense of the patching that has been done before. Now, to discuss the subject that is before you, a view of the law of God without abolition, let me start by setting the scene for this presentation by looking at, leadership, authority, and the law. I suppose most of you would agree with me that when someone gives a law, that is a matter of authority and leadership. I also believe that you can agree with me that you can appreciate the law given by a person according to your view of that person's, position as a leader, as a person in authority, and more specifically according to the character of that person who is giving a law. But the interesting thing is that most of us view leadership and authority, that is the leadership and authority of God, according to the examples of leadership and authority we see around us. We project to God a view of leadership and authority as of our earthly leaders, the heavy-handed, autocratic, even tyrannical, and even, the tough guy, my way or the highway kind of a character and kind of a leadership. That's what we think God is. And what we read in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, seems to support that view of God. We hear of God commanding and requiring the children of Israel some of the very disturbing things. I don't know to you, but to me, it's very disturbing to hear that when one sinner has sinned, other sinners will gather around that sinner with some stones to stone that sinner and destroy him or her in order to remove sin from Israel. That being done by a bunch of sinners. To me, that doesn't make sense. There's something fundamentally wrong with that thing. But when you read the Bible, it tells you that God commanded that. Or eye for an eye, for example. Or what we see in 1 Samuel chapter 15, the Amalekites, when Saul was told to go and destroy the Amalekites, including their children and their babies and their women and their cattle and everything. When you read things like that, you begin to draw parallels between the earthly leaders and what God seems to be in his position and in his character as leadership, as a leader, and as one in authority. So for most of us, it is very hard to see God as a gentle father. And this is true for Christians. Subconsciously, at the back of their minds, they worship God with a certain level of fear, knowing that God can, at any time, if He's not happy with you, He can command some that you be destroyed immediately. So there's a lot of fear behind the worship of God because we've come to understand God's leadership and character from the same perspective that we understand the leadership of the worst of our dictators in this world. But I've come to the view that God is actually contrary to earthly leadership in every way, in every sense of the word. And I want to share with you my views of His law, and that every part of His law is actually an absolute delight if we understand the Father according to His correct character. Now, since I'm coming from an Adventist perspective, it is imperative that I explain how Adventists understand the law, which is the subject that we're dealing with, and we'll relate that to leadership and authority a bit later. So I've come up with a diagram here which represents how Adventists, at least modern Adventists, seem to understand the law. Basically, that it was given in two parts. In the Old Testament, there was the moral law and the ceremonial law. It is believed that the Ten Commandments are the moral law, and that I agree with, but partially, so only. I'll come to that later. Then it is also believed that the ceremonial law has to do with sacrifices and temple services, which one can agree with depending on what is the definition of temple services. And sacrifices, I think they're much easier, but what is the definition of temple services? I'll come back to that later again. Then they say that these sacrificial and temple services were nailed to the cross, and this is usually argued according to Colossians chapter 2 verse 14 or Ephesians chapter 2 verse 15. The argument we give there as Adventists is very interesting, because it is important for us to separate the moral from the ceremonial law, because we believe in keeping the Sabbath, and we are required by our own belief to separate the moral from the ceremonial law so that the Sabbath is not nailed to the cross. And that distinction between moral law and ceremonial law is very interesting. I'm going to touch on that and how it works. But Adventists make the point that the Ten Commandments were written by the finger of God and placed inside of the Ark of Covenant. That is true. Then they say that after that Moses was instructed to write the ceremonial law with his own hand, which was then called the small book that was put beside the Ark of Covenant, and that this is the handwriting of ordinances that is referred to in Colossians chapter 2 verse 14. Now this is very debatable, as I'm going to touch on that just now. Then if you compare Colossians chapter 2 verse 14 and Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 26, you'll see that there is this phrase there, against thee and against us. Then they say that because of this phrase, comparing these two phrases, they are talking about something that is against us, or something that is against thee, or a witness to thee, as it is in Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 26. And they conclude that therefore Colossians 2:14 is referring to Deuteronomy 31:26. And by the way, just if in case you don't know, Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy is the book that was besides the Ark of the Covenant. It says it itself, as it says there in Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 26. So they say, yeah, so this is the book that was besides the Ark of the Covenant, and therefore this is the book that was then nailed to the cross, and that book is done away with, because that book is a book of sacrifices and temple services. But this argument is not consistent. The argument is that to be in the book makes the law ceremonial, and that's not true. If the small book is the ceremonial law, which is the book of Deuteronomy, as we said, then it needs to contain the ceremonial laws only. If its nailing to the cross is to be the nailing of the ceremonial law, then it has to be a book that is containing ceremonial law. In other words, the sacrifices, sacrificial and temple services. But the problem is that there's very little talk about sacrifices and temple services in the book of Deuteronomy. Actually, the book is primarily a moral law book. Not until chapter 12 of the book of Deuteronomy do you even hear sacrifices and offerings being referred to. And even there, they're not referred to in the kind of detail you see in the book of Leviticus, but they're almost mentioned in passing. So if that small book of Deuteronomy was nailed to the cross, how about the 10 commandments that you find in chapter 5 of that same book? How about not following the false prophets as you find in chapter 13? And how about being merciful to your enemy as you find in chapter 22? Are these not moral laws, and were they also nailed to the cross? Are also these done away with? In short, there's no book compilation that you can find in the Bible that represents the ceremonial law. The ceremonial law was never codified in the form of a single book that you could say this book is what represents the ceremonial law. The distinction that makes the ceremonial law separate from the moral law is not based on the existence of a physical book or a physical record. That's the point I'm making. Moses never wrote such a separate book. What Moses wrote contained both moral and ceremonial laws mixed together. In fact, when referring to the law outside of the fact that the 10 Commandments were written on stone, the Bible does not distinguish between the laws as acutely as the Adventist doctrine requires. Not even Christ, not even Paul does such a clear distinction of the laws as the doctrines that we preach as Adventists require. So that point is very important, that there's no such distinction that is given according to the Bible. But there's more evidence that the Bible does not teach the physical distinction between the moral and the ceremonial law as is imagined by most Adventists. Each of the books of Moses that relates to the laws, that is Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all claim to have moral commandments in them which God gave to Moses. In fact, you can read moral commandments in each one of them, just as you may find that they have more on moral commandments than on ceremonial ones. Adventists know that because it is in that source that I quote the SDA net. They say that ceremonial laws are found as parts of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the idea that there was a physical distinct compilation of the ceremonial laws is simply not true. What separates ceremonial from moral is when each commandment is looked at on its own terms and function, not according to the physical body of writing that it belongs to. The definition of moral and the definition of ceremonial or ritual, those are the ways we can distinguish between what is ceremonial and moral based on the definition, not based on the existence of a physical book that is separate. Now, this era of treating the ceremonial law as a single entity, which entity does not exist, it colors how Adventists understand the law wherever it is mentioned in the Bible. That is because all that Adventists need to see in many cases, and I was part of that for some time, to see this as a body of ceremonial law is simply the mention of any single commandment that they can consider to be either moral or ceremonial. So if it says law, then they basically have to think about whether this is ceremonial or moral, as if that is how the ceremonial and moral law were actually given, but they were not given like that. Then when a single commandment is taken to represent the moral law, then we conclude that this is this entire discourse, for example, in Galatians or in the book of Galatians or Romans, we then begin to say that this is all about maybe moral law, or this is all about ceremonial law, because we've taken one of the commandments that we find in that book and classified it, and then everything else that follows must be according to the distinction between the ceremonial and the moral law. This is an issue. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15, for example. But before that, more challenges about the idea of a ceremonial law that was nailed to the cross. Now, the other problem is that if the book of Deuteronomy is the one that was referred to in Colossians 2:14, it means that this little book was contrary to us, and in the way that is, it was against our salvation. Yet the same book says to the contrary in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6 and 7. For it says that this was given by God as wisdom and understanding before the sight of the nations around the children of Israel. And it says that this wisdom and understanding will be something that will impress other nations around them, and it will make God so near to them if they keep those statutes and judgments which are so righteous. It says those were righteous and they were set before them for them to keep. This is the book of Deuteronomy, the book that was besides the Ark of Covenant, as we understand. I think what needs to be understood is that the book itself claims to be a blessing, and it does that several times. But the question is, if you mess up with your blessing, can it become contrary to you? I think it's possible. But the solution to that problem is not removing that blessing, because it is not the blessing's problem. The problem is that you have not been able to give enough regard to the blessing that's been given to you. So the solution is to change the person, not the blessing. But when you look at that argument, which says that, the book of Deuteronomy was contrary to us and it had to be taken out of the way because it was against our salvation. If we conclude that according to Colossians chapter 2, verse 14, then basically what we are saying is that either Moses or God did not tell people, the children of Israel, the truth, that they were receiving a law which was a problem to them. Instead, they called it a blessing when in fact it was a problem. So they sort of deceived them. And that is not accurate. There is a problem there with the way we interpret Colossians chapter 2, verse 14. And not just us, but even other Christians as well. So this law that, according to Adventist interpretation, Colossians 2:14 and Ephesians 2:15, was contrary to us, was in our way, and had to be removed to make way for us, was actually a blessing from God. But there's another challenge. The ceremonial law, if it was nailed to the cross, was of no effect to the Colossians. It was never in their way, nor was it ever contrary to them at any time, because by the time they were converted, the law was long gone. Not just that, the believers at Colossae were predominantly Gentiles. Now, because they were predominantly Gentiles and they were not Jews, there was never a time they were considered to be under the ceremonial law if the ceremonial law was given only to the Jews and not to the New Testament believers. So it could not be written by Paul as saying that the law was contrary to us, because that term contrary to us does not apply to the people who were at Colossae, the Colossians. Not being of Israelite descent meant that it could not be said that the law was contrary to them at some point in the past. If that was what Paul wanted to say, he would have said something like the law was contrary to Israel or the Jews, not inclusive of the Colossians. The ceremonial law was never given to any of the New Testament believers. Therefore, there is no way it could have been said that it was contrary to them at any point. Now, let's come to Ephesians chapter 2 verse 15 as promised. Now there's things that we need to carefully, consider here, right? If you look at this verse beginning, at verse 18 to verse 17, you will see, those ways that I've highlighted, a middle wall of partition between us, the enmity, and you see ways like he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, and referring to the Gentiles, Paul calls them, which were afar off, which means you are not in the commonwealth of Israel according to the promises of salvation. Now, remember I said that the mere mention of the word law can lead some, especially among the Adventists, to believe that the entire body of the ceremonial law is being referred to. What is interesting is that in many Adventist literature, it is assumed that the law being referred to in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 15 is the ceremonial law, while in other denominations literature it is assumed that it is the whole Old Testament law being referred to. So in that understanding, that Adventist understanding, it was the ceremonial law which was the enmity, which was the middle wall of partition between Israel and Gentiles, which made it impossible for Gentiles to unite with Israel, and made it impossible for both the Gentiles and Israel to be reconciled to God. I don't think the ceremonial law ever served that purpose. It was never in any of those capacities in terms of how it relates to us and our relationship between, any one of us, whether Jews or Gentiles, with God. So we can, from this understanding, we can say basically God gave a ceremonial law, called it a blessing, that it must be obeyed, yet the very ceremonial law was the very reason why God could not reconcile with us and the Gentiles could not reconcile with Israel. I don't think that's what, contextually, I don't think that's what Ephesians chapter 2 verse 15 is talking about. It's not talking about that law of commandments as in the ceremonial law, neither is it talking about the Old Testament law, that is together ceremonial law and moral law put together. I don't think that's what it is talking about. It doesn't make sense, at least to me it doesn't make sense. But can the character of God be such that he placed an obstacle between Israel and Gentiles, and between both him and everyone else, then sent his son to remove that very same obstacle that God put in place? Again, that doesn't quite add up to me. Why would he put it first? Why would he put an obstacle first? Why would we put something that is an enmity, something that is a partition, a wall of partition, or something that makes the Gentiles be afar off, and then only then to send his son to remove it, when in fact, he could just not have put it in place? Maybe it is time to consider this simple truth that Paul, in both Colossians 2 verse 14 and Ephesians chapter 2 verse 15, Paul is referring to sin. When he says the law of commandments contained in ordinances, he is referring to the record of sin. The same thing when he says in Colossians chapter 2 verse 14, the handwriting of ordinances, he is also referring to sin. It is sin that separated us from God, separated Israel from Gentiles, and prevented our reconciliation with God. And it is sin that the Son of God came to remove, to do away with, and to nail to the cross. So all scripture and basic common sense agree that the sin, not the law, is the problem. It was never the law that was the problem. So this leaves us with still, a few more problems that we need to consider, which I'm going to cover next. Now, the other problem that we have is how the ceremonial law pointed to Christ. That, of course, requires one to clearly define what is the ceremonial law. This is where Adventist thinking struggles. If you define the ceremonial law as something contained in one book, which book actually is mostly moral law, then defining what the ceremonial law must be very tricky. It becomes very difficult to define what the ceremonial law is, because we think it is a book, or in some ways we also think that it is anything that is outside of the Ten Commandments. That broad sweep of the meaning of ceremonial law makes it almost meaningless. So then, if I ask, what is it in the small book of Deuteronomy that pointed to Christ, we have problems. It was in fact the entire Old Testament which pointed to Christ. When David was promised a son to sit on his throne, that was pointing to Christ's ministry. Much of the book of Psalms, you can check Psalm chapter 2, pointed to Christ's ministry for our salvation. So is much of the book of Isaiah, such as Isaiah's chapters 9 and 53. So are many other prophets, including Haggai chapter 2, verse 6, and Micah chapter 5. So then, if pointing to Christ's ministry is what qualifies a text for nailing to the cross, then the entire Old Testament would also be nailed to the cross, because everything pointed to Christ. Both the moral law and the ceremonial law pointed to Christ. This is the even bigger problem, that the moral law actually pointed to Christ. See, the moral law made the sin clear so that the sinner may know his true state and seek the forgiveness found in Christ. Christ is the full, complete exemplification of the actual meaning of the moral law. So the moral law pointed to him and his sinless existence on this earth. Without the moral law, the sinner could not be driven to Christ, and the standard of righteousness by which Christ was supposed to be, the Lamb of God, would not be there. So to put it differently, if an item was in the sanctuary, then it pointed to Christ. Each one of them, from the very beginning to the very end, each one of them pointed to Christ in one way or the other. Christ's ministry would not be complete without any of those items, including the 2 tablets of stone that were in the Ark of Covenant. The interesting thing is that within the 1888 messages, which many Adventists are familiar with, Ellen White, who is believed by Adventists as the messenger of God, also observes that the moral law and the ceremonial law were together as the schoolmaster, that is, as pointing to Christ. So if to point to Christ is the reason for nailing to the cross, as the schoolmaster ended at the cross, so according to Adventist reasoning, the moral law must also have ended. The book of Ezekiel, chapter 44, contains ceremonial laws, that is, sacrifices and temple services. So the book of Ezekiel must also be nailed to the cross too, right? You may be thinking that I'm running for antinomianism at this point, that I'm saying that, all the law was nailed to the cross, but I'm very far from that. That's not where I'm going at all. So far, I'm only showing that the reasoning used by Adventists around the ceremonial laws and what was nailed to the cross and what was not nailed to the cross does not make sense based on what the Bible itself says, including what Ellen White says. It has many problems. I will offer a different way of looking at the law as what I believe Christ did in Matthew chapter 5. So keep with me on this. I'll come to that just now. So to give the summary of the problems that I've identified so far, the first one is that it is inherently unfair to treat Israel according to the ceremonial law and the Gentiles according to Christ alone. It's inherently fair. It's not according to the character of the Father, in my understanding. There are contradictions that God is, or Moses is saying that the law is a blessing when in fact the law is not a blessing, it is a curse. So we need to understand in what ways exactly is the law a curse. Is it a curse because the law on its own is a curse and it has to be removed, or is it a curse because our response to the law makes it a curse to us, in which case our response is the one that has to change, not the law. The other problem is that the Adventist understanding ignores the fact that the covenant of Christ came first before that of Sinai. In other words, Paul explains this in terms of Sarah, the allegory of Sarah and Hagar, and that the first covenant, the covenant of faith, the actual covenant by which we are saved, was there before the Sinai covenant. So if it was there before the Sinai covenant, why was the Sinai covenant given when the real deal was already existing? Okay. The other problem is that there's no compilation, there's no physical compilation of ceremonial laws in the Bible. It doesn't exist. As a book, it doesn't exist. What makes ceremonial law is the definition, is the function of the law. The other problem is that much of what is called the ceremonial law book is in fact a moral law book. The other problem is that to say that which pointed to Christ must be nailed to the cross also means that the entire Old Testament must be nailed to the cross, because the entire Old Testament, in every one of those books in the Old Testament, it pointed to Christ. So therefore, it also means that the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, must also be nailed to the cross, because they also pointed to Christ's ministry for sin and for righteousness, and his righteousness as well. It does not make sense to say that it was the ceremonial law that was the partition between Israel and Gentiles, or God and all of us. Again, according to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15, it doesn't make sense contextually. All these errors are because of failing to properly identify what the ceremonial law is and making it a single unit physically separate from the moral law, when in fact that is not found anywhere in Scripture. So the problem is that Adventist doctrine about the law are reactive. They were formulated to defeat a challenge from the evangelicals about the Sabbath observance. They are based on trying to ring-fence the Sabbath instead of simply carefully considering the Bible, what the Bible teaches, and harmonizing the apparent contradictions and the law contained therein. As with the Jews, in their efforts to ring-fence the Sabbath, they lost the bigger picture of the law of God. So I would like to introduce you to a different framework, one that does not depend on splitting the law into physical units, the ceremonial law book and the moral law, tablets or stones, but considering individual commandments against the character of God as Christ did. So this will be in my next presentation, which I'm going to share with you how I go about, or how I've come to understand Matthew chapter 5 as a solution to the problem of what is the moral law and what is ceremonial law. Thank you. So wait for the next one. If you are happy to contact us again, you'll find our contact at the first slide that I shared, therockfortress@gmail.com, or our website, therockfortress.net. Thank you.